Have you ever noticed how some people defend their parents harder than they defend themselves? Like, they'll say, my parents did their best, but can't explain why they feel empty in every relationship. They'll say, it wasn't that bad, but flinch when someone asks what they actually need. They'll say, that's just how they are, while spending their entire adult life trying to earn love from people who emotionally checked out decades ago. Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. Some parents never emotionally grew up, and their children paid the price, quietly, politely, and for life. Not with bruises, not with obvious trauma, but with something worse. A constant feeling that something is missing, a lifelong sense of emotional hunger, and the exhausting belief that you are the problem. This video is going to piss some people off, because if you grew up being the mature one, the understanding one, the low maintenance child, there's a good chance you weren't strong. You were abandoned emotionally, and nobody ever told you. Today we're breaking down one of the most quietly devastating psychology books ever written, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Dr. Lindsay C. Gibson. Now, before people get defensive, this book is not about blaming your parents. It's about understanding why some adults should never have been given emotional authority over a child. Dr. Lindsay Gibson is a clinical psychologist with decades of experience working with adults struggling with anxiety, depression, shame, and relationship problems that never made sense until they traced the pattern back to childhood. And here's the uncomfortable pattern she kept seeing. These weren't people who were abused. They weren't neglected physically. They weren't abandoned financially. They were emotionally ignored. Their parents provided food, shelter, education, maybe even discipline, but never emotional safety. No curiosity, no empathy, no interest in who the child actually was. Just expectations. This video is for educational purposes only and falls under the Fair Use Act. Commentary, criticism, and transformation of the original work. I strongly encourage you to buy the book and read it yourself, because no video can replace what happens when you see your own childhood written on a page. But let me be very clear, this will not be a polite summary. This will be a confrontation, because this book doesn't just explain your parents. It explains why you keep choosing emotionally unavailable partners, why you feel guilty for having needs, why you overthink everything, and why peace feels unfamiliar. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. That's where the truth usually starts. Welcome to Mindful Reads Hub. Let's get started. The invisible wound. You finish dinner. You sit in silence. You're physically fed, but emotionally, you're starving. That feeling, the one that sits in the pit of your stomach long after everyone else has gone to bed, isn't just anxiety, self-criticism, or insecurity. Something deeper is happening, something a lot of people go their whole lives without naming. You were emotionally invisible. People talk about childhood trauma like it has to be dramatic, the kind that leaves scars, breaks bones, or ruins relationships overnight. But emotional neglect doesn't work like that. It's subtler, it's quieter, it doesn't punch you in the face, it erodes you slowly, leaving you with an emptiness you learn to call normal. That's what Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents reveals at its core. Growing up with a caregiver who couldn't attune to your inner world doesn't just affect you, it shapes your entire emotional blueprint. Clinical psychologist Lindsay C. Gibson explains that emotionally immature parenting isn't about how many toys you got or whether you had clothes that fit. It's about emotional availability, or the lack of it. How parents respond when you're hurting, confused, joyful, anxious, proud, rejected, or simply just you. If the parent wasn't present in that process, you learned one of the most damaging life lessons possible. Your emotional life didn't matter. That's not just a metaphor, that's a psychological pattern that affects relationships, self-esteem, and emotional regulation all over the world. This is not a US thing only. In the UK, Experts warned members of parliament that being shouted at or verbally abused physically alters a child's brain, reshaping emotional processing, increasing anxiety, and making social connection feel risky and confusing later in life. The study showed that demeaning, hostile language in childhood can widen neural pathways associated with threat and shrink those tied to pleasure, security, and trust, a kind of neurological imprint that follows someone into adulthood. In Australia, researchers showed that childhood maltreatment, which includes neglect, contributes to millions of cases of anxiety, depression, and self-harm later in life, underscoring how early emotional experiences have lifelong consequences that public health systems still don't treat with enough seriousness. Meanwhile, new research from Queen's University Belfast reveals something chilling that Gibson's book hints at. When parents themselves were emotionally neglected as children, they're more likely to become hostile or controlling caregivers rather than warm, attuned ones, a cycle that repeats across generations unless something breaks the pattern. If you grew up with emotionally immature parents, you may not have known you were being neglected because neglect doesn't come with sirens. There were meals on the table, there might have been a roof, but emotional neglect means your inner life, your sadness, your fear, your wonder was not witnessed, reflected, or validated. And when your emotional world wasn't acknowledged as a child, your mind learned to minimize your own needs and internalize self-dismissal just to stay connected. This shows up everywhere. Adult children of emotionally immature parents aren't necessarily angry all the time. They're often hyper-responsible, people-pleasing, or overly self-reliant because vulnerability never paid off for them as kids. They learned early, show your true feelings, and you get met with silence, dismissal, irritation, or a change of subject. That does something to a psyche. It teaches the developing human inside you that emotions are inconvenient or even dangerous, and that emotional repression, especially if it happened consistently through childhood, is now validated by peer-reviewed research showing that emotional neglect directly predicts adult anxiety, problems with emotional regulation, and diminished well-being. Podcasts that explore this phenomenon, like the Messy podcast Breaking Down Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, point out that many adult children of unavailable parents become internalizers, people who learn to bury their needs, believing that expressing them wouldn't make life easier, it would make it worse. And Reddit communities dedicated to emotional neglect aren't just echo chambers. They show the raw human side of these dynamics. People share how emotional neglect didn't stop when childhood ended. It continues in adult relationships, family gatherings, and everyday interactions because the coping strategies learned in childhood are still operating unconsciously. The world may talk about trauma as dramatic moments of crisis, but emotional neglect is insidious. It's the silent absence of attunement that tells a child again and again that their inner world is negligible. It teaches adults that they have to shrink their needs, that vulnerability is weakness, and that emotional contact is a luxury rather than a birthright. This isn't just theory. The lived experience of millions, validated by science, therapy narratives, and global research, shows that emotionally invisible childhood leaves adults feeling unseen in relationships, overly sensitive to rejection, emotionally exhausted in intimacy, compelled to please others, skeptical of emotional safety. You spend your adult life looking for mirrors that never reflect your true self because you weren't mirrored as a child. Key idea: emotional neglect from emotionally immature parents doesn't leave outward scars, but it leaves a deep internal wound that rewires emotional expectations, impacting relationships, self-worth, and emotional regulation across the world. Key takeaway: the pain isn't that you were physically neglected, it's that your emotional experience was invisible. That invisibility becomes a blueprint you replay in adulthood, influencing how you love, trust, and see yourself. Favorite quote: "You were not unseen because you were unworthy of attention. You were unseen because no one knew how to see you." The parent who never grew up. Some people grow up thinking parents are just people who do life with you. Then you meet them in your 30s or 40s and discover, no, your parents were actually emotionally stuck kids pretending to be adults, and you were the emotional caregiver instead of the child. That's the ugly realization Lindsay C. Gibson wants people to finally see in her work. That some parents had children before they ever actually matured emotionally. And that one fact, simple yet brutal, rewires everything you believe about your past, your relationships, and why you still chase approval like a drug. Emotionally immature parenting isn't a trivial lapse in judgment. It's a behavioral pattern that fundamentally shapes how a child learns to interact with the world. These parents lack the emotional capacity to mirror, validate, support, or regulate their children's feelings. They don't have the emotional tools to help a child grow inwardly. This is not about intent. Many of these adults genuinely think they're doing their best. But the result is a childhood where emotional growth was never nurtured. That's a life sentence if you don't understand it. In multiple corners of the psychological literature and pop psychology discourse, from academic research to therapeutic podcasts, the same theme keeps showing up. Emotional immaturity in caregivers leads to insecure adults. A child raised by someone who oscillates unpredictably between affection and withdrawal learns to read emotional cues in hypervigilant, stressful ways. They become adept at anticipating emotional chaos rather than expressing their own internal truth. It's a survival strategy that doubles as an emotional prison. A recent real-world example: a dating or social anxiety trend sweeping therapy groups in places like Australia, the US, and across Europe shows adults who report their parents as unpredictable, reactive, or emotionally unavailable often cope by either clinging to relationships too tightly or avoiding them entirely. In a Guardian article, a woman named Bianca describes how her father's instability conditioned her into a lifetime of emotional hypervigilance, always anticipating emotional storms rather than genuine connection. As an adult, that pattern shaped her trust, romantic intimacy, and sense of self-worth. If you think this is a culture-specific phenomenon, think again. Studies on emotional neglect and parenting styles worldwide reflect similar outcomes. Research synthesizing parental sensitivity and child emotional development shows that stress and lack of emotional attunement, even without outright abuse, correlate with difficulties in emotional regulation later in life. These effects aren't just anecdotal, they are observable in neuroscience studies where children raised in emotionally inconsistent environments have different patterns of stress response and emotion processing. Gibson's core contribution, The Taxonomy of Emotionally Immature Parents, provides a framework that people around the world are now using to name experiences they never had words for. The 4 types she outlines, emotional, driven, passive, and rejecting, are not just labels. They are descriptions of relational patterns that shape lifelong emotional templates. An emotional parent swings unpredictably between warmth and withdrawal, leaving children anxious and compliant. A driven parent pushes productivity and achievement, valuing performance over connection. A passive parent might be nice enough, but fails to provide emotional scaffolding when the child needs it most. A rejecting parent essentially withholds emotional presence entirely. Across cultures, research on attachment and emotional development supports these observations. The Attachment Project notes that emotionally immature caregiving interferes with the development of secure attachment, which is fundamental for healthy adult relationships. What psychology calls an insecure attachment pattern, whether avoidant, anxious, or disorganized, isn't random personality noise. It's often the echo of inconsistent or neglectful emotional responses during childhood. At the crossroads of psychology and lived experience is where people often feel most disoriented. Adult children of emotionally immature parents don't just complain about bad childhoods. They describe persistent patterns of self-doubt, boundary confusion, chronic guilt, and an urge to please people who don't see them. These aren't unique to one culture. They show up in blogs, Reddit communities, therapy cases from South Africa to Scandinavia, all pointing to the same root: a caregiver who could meet physical needs but not emotional ones. The big twist, and this is where real insight comes in, is that the problem isn't the parent's intention, it's the child's adaptive survival strategy. If you learn to be emotionally invisible as a child, it feels normal as an adult. You might even defend your parents' emotional absence as love. After all, they fed you, clothed you, drove you to school. But emotional invisibility leaves a scar that shows up in real, measurable ways. Difficulties forming trust, hyper-responsiveness to criticism, avoidance of emotional vulnerability, or chronic relationship instability. Global mental health data reflects this too. A large proportion of adults reporting anxiety or depression globally trace at least part of their emotional baseline back to early relational environments, where emotional needs were unmet or inconsistently met. Neuroscience and psychology both confirm that emotional regulation, self-worth, and attachment patterns are not just personality traits. They are learned relational responses, formed in childhood and carried into every adult interaction. So the confrontation here isn't an attack on parents who tried. It's a reflection that some environments never equipped children with emotional tools, and that lack doesn't magically disappear at 18, 25, or even 50. Healing starts when you finally name it. You weren't treated with emotional attunement, not because you did something wrong, but because your parents never learned how to give it. That's not your failure, but it is the reason you keep repeating the same relational patterns you thought were just life. Key idea: emotionally immature parenting comes in distinct relational patterns: emotional volatility, perfectionism, passivity, and rejection. And these predictable styles shape lifelong emotional strategies in adult children, reflecting adaptation more than flaw. Key takeaway: understanding your parents' emotional immaturity isn't about blaming them. It's about recognizing the relational blueprint you unconsciously learned and breaking the cycle so you can form healthier connections. Favorite quote: "You can't fix emotional immaturity with love. You must build emotional awareness where it was never taught." The role you were assigned. Some people grow up acting, not being. They learn roles like actors learning lines. Only the stage is real life, and it runs 24/7. They become the fixer, the good one, the quiet one, the invisible one, not because they chose to, but because survival demanded it. When emotionally immature parents couldn't offer attunement, validation, softness, or emotional regulation, their children adapted. Those adaptations weren't just coping mechanisms, they became the clothes they wore, the way they treated people, and the roles they unconsciously replay in friendships, relationships, and even parenting. That's the ugly, unspoken truth adult children of emotionally immature parents tries to name, that when emotional availability is missing, kids don't just survive, they morph into something else. And sometimes that something else looks successful, capable, unflappable, diplomatic, but underneath protocols, routines, and people-pleasing is a deeper pain you'd learn to hide from yourself. According to research across multiple fields, psychology, attachment theory, neurobiology, children adapt to emotionally unavailable caregivers in structured ways that literally shape their internal working models of self and others. In attachment theory, those internal models are like mental schemas, deeply encoded beliefs about whether relationships are safe, how emotions get met, and whether needs matter. If a caregiver is unavailable or dismissive, a child doesn't just learn not to express need, they learn not to expect emotional support from others at all. That's called an insecure attachment pattern, and it shows up as either intense clinginess or cold emotional distance in adult relationships, neither of which feels like freedom. It feels like survival strategy. In global research, children who grow up without emotional attunement, where their feelings are minimized, ignored, or punished, don't just develop sad memories, they reorganize neurobiological systems. They become less adept at emotional regulation, less confident in identifying and communicating emotions, and more likely to default to either internalizing turning pain inward or externalizing acting out coping strategies. A study published in BMC Psychology found that parental emotional neglect, defined as lack of warmth, emotional support, and responsiveness, correlates with reduced emotional intelligence and increased use of maladaptive coping strategies in both childhood and adulthood, especially if nurturance was absent or inconsistent. Internalizers, the ones this part of the book highlights, are a particularly subtle phenomenon. They aren't the defiant ones who explode or demand attention. They are the ones who absorb everything. They bury their needs so deeply they sometimes can't even identify them. They become people pleasers, overthinkers, self-suppressors, emotional hermits who learned early that expressing need doesn't get you seen, it gets you shut down. Online communities around emotional neglect and adult children of emotionally immature parents reflect this vividly. People describe physical exhaustion not from activity, but from the emotional effort of suppressing emotional need, living in hypervigilance for others' needs instead of their own, and carrying self-criticism as a default inner voice for decades. Take the story of Bianca. She talks about how her unpredictable father conditioned her not only to anticipate emotional dissonance, but to manage it for others. As an adult, she found herself constantly trying to read people's emotional states, trying to predict their reactions. Not because she's particularly gifted at empathy, but because that hypervigilance was her survival mechanism as a child. She lived in a house where the emotional ground shifted without warning, so she learned to adapt to everyone else's emotional needs rather than develop a stable sense of her own. This adaptation becomes internalized. It becomes a role, not a choice. This internalization is confirmed by neuroscientific research. Children raised with emotional unavailability often have weaker emotion regulation skills and lower trait emotional intelligence, meaning they struggle more with recognizing, labeling, and expressing both their own emotions and those of others. These aren't just personality quirks. They are patterns carved into the brain through repeated social experience. But here's the brutal part. Internalizing isn't laziness or weakness. It's the brain's calculated survival strategy. Children realized early, if I show need, it will be ignored or judged. If I stay silent, at least I won't get punished. If I meet others' emotional needs first, maybe I will get met back. That's why so many adults who were internalizers become caretakers, peacemakers, conflict avoiders, and perfectionists. It's not because they want to, it's because they learned that being seen might result in emotional risk or rejection, a risk they were never emotionally safe enough to take as children. And this isn't confined to one culture. Research on avoidant attachment styles, common among people raised with emotionally distant caregivers, shows that emotional detachment, difficulty showing affection, and prioritizing others' perceived needs over your own are worldwide phenomena recognized across psychological literature. Avoidant attachment is linked to a reluctance to trust others, dismissiveness of emotional intimacy, and a strong preference for independence, all protective strategies that ironically sabotage connection. Online discussions by people identifying as internalizers often echo this theme. They talk about feeling like both child and parent in their childhood homes, forced into emotional responsibility long before maturity was appropriate. This duality, internalizing other people's emotions while suppressing your own, is a signature pattern of invisible emotional labor that children of emotionally immature parents carry into adulthood. But internalizing doesn't just affect relationships, it affects identity. When your emotional world was minimized as a child, you don't just learn to suppress emotion, you learn to doubt your right to feel anything at all. You grow up believing that your emotions are a burden or that your needs are negotiable. That's not just a habit, that's a learned belief system that dictates how you show up in the world. People raised this way often struggle with saying no, experience chronic guilt when prioritizing themselves, and assume emotional self-sacrifice is noble until they hit burnout, relational instability, or a crisis that forces them to finally question all the roles they've been performing for decades. What's most striking, and what makes this phenomenon global, is how frequently it shows up in personal narratives, clinical research, and psychological communities. Internalizers are not anomalies. They are patterns, structured responses to emotional deprivation that show up in therapy rooms from Tokyo to Toronto, London to Lagos, and Sydney to Sao Paulo. It's not culture, intelligence, or success that protects you. It's a tuned emotional response from caregivers. And when that missing element becomes the invisible wound, it reshapes everything. Key idea: survival in emotionally unavailable environments teaches children to internalize emotional needs, a learned role where they adapt to others while suppressing their own feelings, shaping attachment patterns and emotional regulation throughout life. Key takeaway: internalizing isn't a character flaw, it's a survival mechanism formed in response to emotional neglect. Healing begins by recognizing the role you learned isn't your authentic self, but a pattern developed to stay emotionally alive. Favorite quote: "You didn't become the fixer because you were strong, you became it because no one ever fixed you." The moment the illusion breaks, there comes a point in the messy, tangled emotional life of every adult child of an emotionally immature parent when the illusion just collapses. It doesn't happen with fireworks, it happens with a slow, internal cracking, like the moment you finally realize the person you were raised by was never going to be the parent you needed. Not because they chose to be cruel, but because they simply never learned how to love in the first place. That realization and the collapse of the fantasy that they would change feels like losing a part of your identity. It's a quiet breaking that's both devastating and, paradoxically, the beginning of freedom. In the book, Gibson describes this moment not as a singular event, but a psychological turning point. The first time you clearly see that love was conditional, and the conditions were set by someone who didn't actually know how to give unconditional support. That instability, that lack of emotional foundation, isn't just frustration or disappointment. It's trauma in the developmental sense, a pattern of emotional starvation that teaches you to doubt your emotional reality. This realization often unfolds in adulthood. Anxiety spikes, relationships repeatedly collapse, emotional needs feel unquenchable, or a partner reflects back the same pattern you grew up with. It's less a revelation than a mirror. The same emotional scarcity you survived as a child now shows up in every connection you attempt as an adult. That's not coincidence, that's the echo of unresolved emotional patterns. Contemporary psychology recognizes this as a form of intergenerational emotional transmission. Parents who cannot regulate empathy and emotional availability tend to raise adults who internalize that dysregulation. Worldwide research on emotional neglect shows the long-term effects of growing up without consistent emotional attunement. A meta-analysis on emotional neglect and attachment finds that when caregivers consistently fail to meet a child's emotional needs, not through abuse, but through absence, children are more likely to develop insecure attachment styles and emotional dysregulation in adulthood. These patterns show up globally in clinical populations from Europe to Asia, where unresolved early emotional experiences predict anxiety, relationship difficulties, and self-esteem issues. On a societal scale, the consequences are stark. A major Australian study linked childhood maltreatment, including neglect, directly to mental health conditions like depression and self-harm, accounting for nearly 1/4 of such diagnoses nationally. Researchers argued that emotional neglect isn't a fringe issue, it's a public health crisis. In many parts of the world, emotional support is still treated as optional parenting rather than a core human need, contributing to rising global rates of anxiety, interpersonal conflict, and chronic loneliness. This breaking point, the moment you wake up to how dysfunctional your emotional mirror was, often feels like disillusionment. It feels like betrayal, but it's really the first clear view of reality instead of fantasy. People who grew up with emotionally immature parents spend their lives hoping for emotional responsiveness that will never come. They believe that maybe, just maybe, if they show enough loyalty, kindness, or achievement, their parent will finally respond with unconditional love. That's the fantasy. The truth? Your parent's emotional capacity was never infinite. It was always limited, often because their own emotional needs were never met when they were children. The personal stories that flood therapy forums and support communities reflect this painful awakening. One Reddit user in the community about emotional neglect said the hardest part of realizing their parents' limitations wasn't the injustice. It was the moment they understood they were expecting something their parent could never give. That insight, once it hits, feels like a kind of death and birth at the same time. Recognition that the emotional figure who should have been safe was never capable of providing safety, and the realization that you were not responsible for their emotional deficits. Documentaries and films about childhood trauma, from PBS's Whole People series to psychology YouTube documentaries, reinforce how early emotional experiences leave long-lasting imprints on adult behavior, mental health, and relational patterns. They show that while some children endure neglect and grow into well-regulated adults, many others carry those early wounds into adulthood in ways that shape every decision, attachment, and self-perception. In the fragile space where hope dissolves into clarity, you might experience grief, anger, numbness, or even relief. That's the emotional paradox of realizing love was conditional. You mourn the relationship you thought you had, even if it never really existed. But this moment, painful as it is, marks the first step toward emotional autonomy rather than endless chasing. When the illusion breaks, you stop trying to fix someone else and start learning how to heal yourself. Because the real awakening isn't about your parents' failure. It's about your recognition that their emotional immaturity wasn't your fault. And that is the pivot point where your emotional story stops being a loop and begins to become something you can rewrite, reclaim, and finally live on your own terms. Key takeaway: emotional maturity doesn't spontaneously show up with age, especially in caregivers who never learned emotional regulation themselves. And the moment you see this clearly is often your first step toward true emotional independence. Key takeaway: the collapse of the fantasy that love will come from an emotionally immature parent is painful but freeing. When you recognize that the emotional deficit was never your fault, you begin the real work of healing and forming healthier bonds. Favorite quote: "The illusion doesn't fall apart because your parent exploded. It falls apart when you finally stop waiting for what they were never capable of giving." Detaching without destroying yourself. There's a dangerous illusion most adult children of emotionally immature parents hold for decades, that detachment means abandonment, that if they stop trying to rescue someone who never wanted rescue in the first place, they're selfish, that pulling back emotionally is weakness. In reality, what emotionally neglected children spend their entire lives fighting for, connection, validation, emotional reciprocity, is exactly what their parents were never capable of giving in the first place. So how do you stop being pulled back into the same old emotional gravity? How do you stop being the emotional caregiver, stuck in a loop of guilt, obligation, and old roles? That's the hard lesson this phase of the psychological journey teaches, and it's far from easy. When you grow up in a household where emotional needs were ignored, inconsistency was the norm, and affection was conditional or absent, your emotional brain learns a pattern: attempt connection, avoid conflict, suppress your needs, and prioritize others to stay safe. This isn't personality, it's a survival strategy developed over years. It's how you learn to live with emotional scarcity, but that strategy becomes an anchor that drags you back into old patterns in every major relationship: romantic partners, friendships, bosses, even parenting your own kids. And detaching without self-destruction means recognizing the emotional contract you thought existed was always conditional, and learning to renegotiate from reality instead of fantasy. In psychological research, this is supported by studies showing how emotional neglect affects long-term well-being, not just in childhood, but into adulthood. A European Journal of Trauma and Dissociation study found that emotional neglect early in life is strongly associated with increased risk for anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and difficulties with emotion regulation as adults. These are not quirks of personality. They are measurable consequences of emotional deprivation, not just physical neglect. The absence of sustained emotional connection weakens the internal infrastructure needed for healthy emotion regulation and social support in later life. Part of detaching from past emotional hooks means understanding what emotional neglect really does to a developing brain. Stanford University research shows that when fundamental emotional needs aren't met, when caregivers consistently fail to provide comfort, safety, or attunement, individuals are more likely to develop traits like alexithymia, the difficulty in identifying or articulating emotions. Those with high levels of alexithymia often struggle in relationships because they can't read emotional cues or express internal feelings clearly, leading to misunderstandings, loneliness, and a chronic sense of disconnection that feels like something's wrong with me. But the science shows it's not personal weakness, it's a developmental imprint of emotional neglect during crucial early years. Podcasts and therapy dialogues emphasize this point again and again. In episodes like The Psychology of Emotionally Immature Parents from iHeart, experts explain how adult children carry these early coping strategies forward, thinking they're just bad at relationships, when in fact their patterns learn to survive emotionally unavailable environments. Emotional detachment becomes self-protection. Hyper-responsiveness becomes vigilance, and suppressing your needs becomes your default emotional posture because expressing them was unsafe or useless as a child. This dynamic is also emerging in clinical narratives globally. When children grow up without emotional attunement, they don't just miss out on occasional affection, they miss out on forming the internal sense of self that comes from being validated and mirrored. Studies show that when caregivers aren't emotionally responsive, children are less likely to develop emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and empathy, the very tools needed for healthy adult relationships. A BMC psychology paper found that parental neglect is negatively associated with trait emotional intelligence, meaning the emotional foundation you needed wasn't just missing, it was actively undermined by absence of care. Here's the confrontation most people don't want to hear. Learning to detach isn't about cutting people off out of anger. It's about recognizing that your neediness isn't the problem. Your outdated survival strategy is. Many adult children of emotionally immature parents spend years looping back into dysfunctional interactions because they hope something will finally shift. This is exactly the trap. Hope is not a strategy. It's a survival instinct, and your nervous system still thinks you're a child desperate for emotional safety. Global support conversations, from Reddit communities to international therapy forums, confirm this lived experience. Adult children share how they often switch between guilt and resentment, maintain cycles of overreaching in relationships, or collapse emotionally when their efforts aren't reciprocated. They often apologize for having needs, believing needs themselves are the problem, not the lack of emotional reciprocity that shaped their earliest relationships. Healing from this means shifting roles. It means learning to stop carrying the emotional labor of others as your responsibility. It means recognizing that when a caregiver failed to attune to you, they weren't rejecting you. They were limited by their own unhealed wounds, inconsistent emotional self-awareness, and survival strategies that never matured. These patterns aren't excuses. They're explanations that help you see what was really happening. You were never emotionally supported, and you learned to adapt in ways that protected your survival, not your joy. Part of becoming free of those old roles is confronting the shame cycle, the internal voice that tells you you're too much, too sensitive, too complicated, when in truth, your brain has been trying to protect you. Podcasts like Adult Child, The Not Good Enough Wound, highlight how internalized shame and self-sabotage aren't inherent flaws, but echoes of emotional invalidation that were never met in childhood. The shame you carry isn't your true self. It's the voice of survival coping, mistaken for self-criticism. This doesn't mean you never feel guilt, hurt, or nostalgia for old relational patterns. It means you're transitioning out of emotional captivity. You're learning to say, I need space, I need reciprocity, and I need to stop replaying roles that made you feel entitled to my emotional labor. And that's not cold, that's growth. Key idea: emotional detachment from old patterns isn't emotional abandonment. It's recognizing and reconstructing outdated survival strategies learned in emotionally neglectful environments, enabling healthier relationships and self-understanding. Key takeaway: healing is not about suppressing your emotions or rejecting connection. It's about unlearning survival roles, reclaiming your emotional agency, and stopping the cycle of carrying others' emotional weight as if it were your responsibility. Favorite quote: detachment isn't rejection, it's the courage to stop giving what was never returned. Finding emotionally safe people. You think emotionally mature people are just nice and polite? That emotional maturity means being calm all the time or never arguing? That's not emotional maturity, that's avoidance. Real emotional maturity is capacity under pressure, the ability to stay conscious of yourself and others, to hold empathy without losing self-respect, to see your own emotional triggers and take responsibility for them, and to speak truth even when exposing it feels like pointing a spotlight at your failures. That's the difference between someone emotionally stuck in old patterns and someone who actually knows how to connect, repair, and sustain real intimacy. The very thing adult children of emotionally immature parents spend their lives getting wrong until they learn otherwise. This final phase of the journey, finding emotionally safe people, is not about luck. It's about knowing what emotional maturity actually looks like everywhere in the world, inside yourself and in others. A global psychological pattern shows that emotionally mature people don't just feel better, they respond better, and that matters. Psychology calls emotional maturity a blend of self-awareness, emotional regulation, empathy, and accountability. These aren't buzzwords. They're observable behaviors that consistently show up in people who have healthy relationships and stable emotional lives. According to psychology experts, emotionally mature adults take full responsibility for their feelings, reactions, and lives, rather than projecting blame onto others or letting emotions hijack their responses. They can hold empathy for themselves and others at the same time. They speak the truth, even when it hurts, and they don't shy away from conflict, they manage it. These are not traits you fake once or twice. These are patterns of behavior anchored in internal regulation, not emotional reflexes. Real emotional maturity also means you understand that others' emotional reactions are theirs, not yours. You don't own or fix everyone else's feelings. That's a global heuristic for relational health. In cross-cultural studies of attachment and adult functioning, individuals with secure attachment, a marker often linked to emotionally responsive caregivers, demonstrate better emotion regulation, increased empathy, and stable relationship satisfaction compared to those with insecure attachment histories. That's why emotionally mature people manage conflicts without collapsing into fight, flight, or frozen withdrawal. Podcasts diving into these themes highlight that emotional maturity isn't a static trait, it's a continuum, especially influenced by stress levels and life experience. In interviews with Dr. Lindsay Gibson on the Being Well podcast, she explains that emotionally immature patterns can feel familiar and normal if that's what someone was raised with. But true emotional maturity is marked by awareness, the ability to recognize when you're reacting from a past wound versus when you're responding from your authentic self. This insight is what differentiates emotionally mature responses from habitual defensive ones. Think about how this plays out in ordinary life around the world. In a workplace, an emotionally mature colleague doesn't avoid feedback. They seek it. They don't deflect blame. Instead, they ask, "What can I learn here?" That's a sign of emotional regulation and growth orientation. In romantic relationships, an emotionally mature person doesn't default to silence when discomfort arises. They communicate needs and boundaries clearly, without aggression or passive-aggressive manipulation. In families, emotionally mature adults create space for others' emotional experiences, even when they don't match their own. That's the real definition. Not perfection, but adaptive response, where emotions become information, not obstacles. Globally, research shows emotional maturity is less about age and more about life learning and self-reflection. A UK report found broad patterns of how adults navigate emotional volatility, with emotional regulation skills, often aligned with maturity, mediating psychological well-being and social stability in adulthood. Emotional instability, often linked to insecure attachments, fuels anxiety and interpersonal conflict, whereas emotional regulation correlates with better relationships and personal resilience. In personality psychology, emotionally mature adults tend to demonstrate what the Attachment Project calls secure attachment behaviors, transparency in emotions, comfort with vulnerability, and the ability to offer support without needing to control the situation. These markers emerge in how they listen, how they apologize, and how they repair after conflict. But here is the confrontation many people raised by emotionally immature parents resist. Recognizing emotionally mature people means learning to notice patterns of behavior, not longing for idealized connection. Emotional maturity isn't about being nice or agreeable. It's about consistency under pressure, accountability, and maintenance of self while caring for others. It's not about emotional perfection, it's about emotional responsibility. Someone can be calm and still be immature. Someone can be expressive and still lack empathy. Emotional maturity is measured in how you handle yourself when emotions are raw, not when everything is smooth. There's a massive shift happening across global mental health discourse. Emotional literacy and maturity are being recognized as skills developed over a lifetime, influenced by early relational patterns but not determined by them. Programs that focus on emotional education, from child schooling to adult therapy, emphasize that understanding emotions, managing them constructively, and communicating them clearly are foundational for mental health and well-being. In practical terms, emotionally mature people show certain behaviors that are consistent whether they're in Canada, Japan, Brazil, or South Africa. They take ownership of mistakes, apologize without excuses, empathize without collapsing into the other's emotional state, and regulate emotional responses even when they feel triggered. They don't need to be clinically perfect. They need to be consistently conscious. So what does it mean when someone raised by emotionally immature parents starts to notice these patterns in others? It means they're recognizing what healthy emotional connection looks like, and that's the real marker of healing. It means they're done modeling off emotional scarcity and finally reaching for something reciprocal, responsive, and emotionally grounded. Real emotional safety feels unfamiliar at first. That's because your nervous system was trained on unpredictability. But emotionally mature people, the ones worth building relationships with, don't swing wildly between withdrawal and neediness. They stay present, they show up emotionally, and they don't expect you to carry their inner world for them. That's how you know you're no longer unanchored. You're not just surviving connections, you're cultivating them. Key idea: emotionally mature adults consistently regulate their own emotions, take responsibility for feelings, communicate honestly, and create secure environments for others, traits validated by psychological research and described by experts as foundational to healthy relationships. Key takeaway: recognizing emotionally safe people isn't about wishful thinking. It's about learning to see behavioral patterns of accountability, empathy, and emotional regulation, and cultivating those same traits within yourself to break cycles of emotional scarcity. Favorite quote: real emotional maturity isn't the absence of emotion, it's the ability to handle it with conscious responsibility and care. Conclusion. So let's end this the way the journey actually feels. Not like a tidy summary, but like a blow to the chest and a torch lighting up everything you've been pretending wasn't there. You came in thinking maybe the hurt was temporary. Maybe you were just sensitive, or overthinking, or taking everything too personally. You thought maybe life's discomfort was just the cost of boring adult problems, bills, work, relationships, stress. But after peeling back decades of emotional conditioning, therapy jargon, cultural scripts, global psychology research, and lived experience, we've landed on a truth that's far bigger, more personal, and more liberating than you bargained for. The emotional wound you feel isn't random. It isn't a character flaw, a weakness, or a personality quirk. It is a scar left by emotional neglect, a form of developmental injury that millions experience, but so few talk about because it doesn't leave bruises, it leaves belief systems. From the first time your feelings were ignored, not acknowledged, not mirrored, not felt with, a pattern was being carved into your nervous system. A pattern that says, your emotions don't matter unless someone with power validates them. And that pattern doesn't disappear when you turn 18 or 25 or even 40. It echoes in your relationships, your self-image, your sense of safety, your ability to trust, and the way you show up for yourself. We explored how emotionally immature parents, whether dismissive, unpredictable, cold, or wrapped up in their own unmet needs, shape children into survival modes instead of emotional beings. Those adaptations, people-pleasing, internalizing, role-taking, emotional suppression, all made perfect sense in the context you grew up in. They weren't flaws, they were strategies that kept you alive when no one else could sit with your hurt. And here's the wrenching beauty of it all. That disguise of strength, of calm, control, self-sacrifice, was never strength at all. It was a shield. and your entire adult life has been an attempt to find the emotional security you were never given in childhood. That's why relationships with emotionally mature people feel unfamiliar, even unsettling at first. You were trained to expect instability, not attunement, avoidance, not presence, inconsistency, not safety. Global psychologists now warn that emotional neglect isn't a small problem, it's a public health concern. Lack of emotional validation in childhood is linked to anxiety, depression, poor emotional regulation, and difficulty forming secure bonds with others around the world. In families across Canada, China, Europe, Africa, and Australia, the same patterns show up. Children don't just lose emotional support, they lose permission to feel, to need, and to be fully human. And even more striking is how this absence doesn't just affect you, it can ripple through generations, shaping how people parent their own kids, how they regulate stress, how they express tenderness, and how they define love. Emotional neglect travels across family trees because unresolved emotional wounds tend to reappear unless they're consciously addressed and healed. But here's where the crescendo hits, the big undeniable truth. You are not broken because you were unseen. You were unseen because the people you depended on weren't taught how to see, and that was never your fault. The shame you carry, it's not yours. The guilt you feel for having needs, not yours. The confusion about why love feels conditional, not yours. You were trained to survive emotional invisibility, but now you can define emotional maturity on your own terms. You can choose reciprocity over sacrifice. You can choose attunement over avoidance. You can choose presence over performance. That is not idealism. That is evidence-based psychological transformation. There are real strategies, therapy, emotional education, self-validation work, boundary setting, reparenting yourself, that help you reclaim the emotional life that was never given to you. The science, the voices, the global stories all point to one thing: emotional growth is possible even after emotional starvation. And here's the hardest part to swallow, and the most liberating. You don't have to fix other people to heal. You just have to learn how to feel what you were never allowed to feel and let that drive your growth instead of your fear. So let this be the finale that you never forget. You're not a problem to be solved. You are a human being whose emotional life was never fully acknowledged until now. If this has resonated, if it has pierced open something in you that you've tried to ignore or numb for years, then do not let it stop here. Dive deeper. Understand yourself. Start the hard work of emotional reparenting and boundary building. Get curious about the why behind your reactions. And above all, stop playing small in relationships that never taught you how to be seen. If you want that full blueprint, the real, unvarnished, compassionate roadmap to healing, go buy Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay C. Gibson. Read it, feel it, wrestle with it. This summary is just the beginning. The book is the real journey. Your emotional self is not a mystery, it's a puzzle with pieces that finally make sense when laid out honestly. And that's where freedom begins.